Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to IO Radio with your hosts, Adam and Sal.
Hello, everyone.
And it's been a little while since we've done another show. We've been meaning to, but obviously there's all kinds of things that start happening. And I contacted Sal and said, hey, let's do this because I've been pouring through the Bitcoin 2023 Miami footage and putting together a highlight reel that I think is going to be very amusing. It's kind of our truth remix of it. And there's little pieces of it that have been floating around, and we commented on it. It was the episode before last or the one before that one? Where we
I don't remember.
Yeah. But at the end of one of our things, we watched some of it in its early stages. So stay tuned for that. This will be the second year I've done it. And it's a pretty amusing video. So in pouring over all of this, I came across Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s, quote, keynote at the Bitcoin conference. And he said a lot of stuff in there that I really feel we need to kind of interrupt and talk about. He's a guy that is a great example of a populist politician. And he says a lot of things that most people can connect with. But then he has a tendency of intertwining some batshit crazy stuff into it as well. So it's really a kind of a subversive approach that he's taking politically that I feel like we need to kind of comment on.
And correct, but he's a Democrat.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Right. Although I don't know if a lot of Democrats want to kind of claim him as their own. So
you really liked his keynote then?
I found myself just cringing a lot, and I wanted to kind of, if I was there, I would have screamed bullshit, quite a number of times.
All right, so let's do that online instead.
Okay, so before we get into more, background on him, well, just basically, he's the son of Robert Kennedy Sr., who is, I guess, the brother of JFK, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct. Yeah, and they're both those two were the sons of Joseph Kennedy.
Joseph Kennedy. And so basically, he comes from a very, very wealthy, powerful family that has a very colorful history, as many people probably know. John F. Kennedy was generally pretty beloved as a president, and when he was assassinated very young, he is credited with the Cuban Missile Crisis, averting a potential war with Russia in the 60s. But he was also known for having an affair with Marilyn Monroe. So I don't think he's necessarily the role model we need historically. But
yeah, I mean, Kennedy was sort of famous for, I think, having sex with anything that walked. So.
But that was back in a time when that wasn't political suicide. That you might have had marital infidelity. Now, apparently, if you even text somebody something, it can be bad. So let's go into his keynote, and we're just gonna stop and comment on it as we go.
Okay, so we're still recording.
Hello, Bitcoiners.
Okay.
There's a lot of people who are not in this room for whom Bitcoin may seem an issue that's too trivial for a presidential campaign. David Bailey at a party that we were at last night asked me how I got sold on Bitcoin. And I told him that it happened to me in an instant when I saw what happened at the trucker strike in Ottawa.
Okay, so you can see the audio is out of sync with the video here. I found this to be a problem with some of Bitcoin Magazine's stuff. Now, when I used the video, I actually corrected it's like 12 frames off or something. So I hope people watch.
So we can do what you want. Like, if you want, we could use the other.
No, feed. It's fine. Just you're gonna see. You see that how it's how the audio and the video is off. This is how technologically advanced these bozos are. There's a latency between the audio and the video, and they didn't even bother to fix it.
So I just like to point out, though, that what sold him on Bitcoin were probably campaign contributions and super PAC money.
Well, as I said, I want to talk about this because he says a lot of stuff that I agree with and I can identify with, but then he also says a lot of stuff that I absolutely don't. And this is a great example of how, politics is usually more complicated than people who try to claim it is. They just, all politicians are bad and blah, blah, blah. But let's listen to what he has to say. There's definitely some stuff here we're gonna have to clarify and fact check.
A few months before that, I had gone to Italy, and I had given a public speech to a large crowd in Italy about the dangers of digital currency, and particularly programmable currency that could be used by governments to enforce, to punish bad behavior in combination with surveillance systems and facial recognition systems that the government would know when you were doing something wrong and could change your credit card. And this is what's happening in China. So they would only purchase groceries within maybe a 5-minute walk of your home.
Right.
This is part of this fucking bullshit where they don't want people to get rid of their cars. They want to pretend as though being able to bike to a grocery store to pick up groceries is somehow totalitarianism.
Well, he's comparing it to China, and I guess China is trying to maybe, I don't know why, I don't even know if this is true. He says a lot of stuff that's really not true. You know, that wag the dog kind of thing where you find one anomalous story about something that seems kind of oppressive and draconian, and then you just suggest that's happening all over China.
Yeah, from what I understand, my friends who have lived in China, it is a very cash-heavy society. A lot of them were English teachers there, getting paid in cash, paying for things in cash, and they would measure their savings in inches. So how much savings do you have? Oh, I've got 5 inches. They would just measure their stack of bills. So I'm not sure that China is perhaps the best example here.
Yeah, okay. A little bit, and let's see what we got.
And I said that hypothetically, and I think 6 weeks after I made that speech, I saw that very thing happen to the truckers in Ottawa.
Okay, so let me scare you with a hypothetical that never really happened, and then claim that it happened to the truckers. And of course, yeah, this trucker thing is something we got to talk about.
As most of you know, that trucker strike was a peaceful demonstration.
Stop.
Certainly wasn't peaceful for a lot of the people who were living in Ottawa at the time.
Yeah. Peaceful is standing off to the side, holding up signs and yelling and screaming. If you're blockading the interstates and the trade routes, that's not peaceful. You're interfering with the normal operation of a society. You're stopping ambulances from getting to people that are in need of medical care.
So and here's the other thing. I live in Toronto, which wasn't even the main city for the protest, but there were a number of protesters here as well. And while that was happening, I had friends who are nurses and doctors who were being told, listen, don't go to work in your scrubs. Don't wear anything that is going to let anyone know that you work for a hospital, because people were being harassed and people were being prevented from going to work, even here in Toronto. So never mind Ottawa. And this had to do with their belief that, all of the health measures were illegitimate. Many of them believed that the vaccines were going to kill people or were ineffective.
Right.
So, I don't know, to characterize it purely as a peaceful protest. Okay. They weren't shooting anyone.
I mean, it's wrong. Now
it was causing chaos in the cities that they were in.
Now, there may have been isolated incidences of violence where some of these people inspired by the truckers were doing horrible things, and we can say, okay, that's not representative of the majority of the protesters. Fair enough. But the key protesters, the Canadian truckers, absolutely did break the law. They did interfere, blockade and block areas and interfere with the normal operation of society. So they affected people, innocent people, and that's certainly not legal. And he'll say here, none of them were ever charged with a crime or anything. That just doesn't mean they didn't commit something.
Yeah,
people who were demanding rights that are sacred and are taken for granted for every American. The right to be free of government mandates, the right for free assembly, the right for free speech, the right to petition our government, all of those things that we take for granted. And
What about the right to healthcare? What about the right to a living wage? What about the right to be free from corporate special interests dictating policy and government? So notice how he doesn't say any of these things,
Right.
because that's what this guy stands for.
Yeah, I don't know enough about who's paying him off to know about that, but yeah, what about the right to just be able to get to your office and not have to go through a blockade of crazy idiot truckers?
nonetheless, and it was a peaceful demonstration, nonetheless, the Canadian government fiercely repressed the truckers' protests.
Now, I'm under the impression that they let these truckers protest for quite a while and didn't do anything. It was it was only after they just wouldn't they became more and more invasive, right?
I would say that I don't necessarily think that every step that Trudeau took was justified. But there is a question here which is never discussed in this video, which is many of those truckers were receiving funds from foreign nations. So they weren't domestic.
Right. He's going to get to
necessarily,
that. We
necessarily
can talk about
Canadians funding it. And then you have a question of, well, should a sovereign nation be allowing political interference to occur from other nations in terms of funding? So if there were people the government of China or people in China were sending money to fund a protest, an anti-vaccine protest in Canada, I think there's some legitimacy to cutting off those funds.
I agree with you. I think you're getting a little bit ahead of us, though. We're not even to the point where he's talking about that yet. We're just talking about the legality of the actual thing in the first place. He's claiming, we're trying to debunk this claim right here, which is he claimed it's 100% legal. Nobody did anything wrong. Now we're going to get into what they did. We can talk about the rationale for why they did it. So you'll see. We'll see.
Government officials declared a state of emergency. They suppressed free speech. Perhaps most alarmingly, they froze the bank accounts of hundreds of protesters and their supporters, which they identified using surveillance and data monitoring technologies.
Now, I don't know the details of this, but did they actually freeze their individual bank accounts, or did they just freeze some accounts they were using that were soliciting donations?
They froze individual bank accounts.
Oh, they did.
I'm fairly certain that they did. Listen, I'm not an expert on the truck protests. So please don't quote me. I may be incorrect, but I am under the impression that they did freeze the bank accounts.
I guess if those accounts, as you say, were receiving foreign money.
Like it wasn't well organized. So what they were doing is certain people were getting the cash and then they were trying to distribute it. They were getting it into their accounts. They were taking it out in 20s and going around and trying to distribute it to, the people.
And those are the people who had their accounts frozen.
Correct.
So they were basically operating probably some kind of an unlicensed charity or something, right? Because they were soliciting donations and then they were distributing it and dispersing it, presumably not declaring any of it either.
Listen, I have no idea about the legal specifics. I know that there's some controversy about whether the emergency powers that were used by the Prime Minister were justified or not.
Yeah.
But I can tell you that most Canadians were in favor of getting those people off of the streets in the cities that they were in.
Right. And of course,
people that you'll talk to will be like, yes, absolutely. We indulged them far too much.
Yeah. And the proof of that is that Trudeau was reelected after this, right? So this notion that he did this without the support of the people is obviously false.
Some of these lawful and peaceful protesters, none of these lawful and peaceful protesters had violated any law. Again, they had not been charged, and they certainly had not been convicted.
I did do some research and pulled up some stuff, and if you do your research, there is some stuff that they did.
But suddenly they found that they could not access their money, their bank accounts, to pay their mortgages or to feed their families. When I witnessed this cataclysm, this devastating use of government repression, I realized for the first time how free money is as important to freedom as free expression.
So, free money is important,
Just very quickly, I want to make one correction. Just so you know, the election was before the trucker protests.
Okay.
So it was before.
I thought it was after. I thought he was re-elected.
So it was early 2022 when those protests started, and the election, I believe, was in September of 2021.
Okay. I stand corrected. I sort of swore I read something different, but okay. So let's talk about this free money. Obviously, he's at a Bitcoin convention, and he's suggesting that Bitcoin could have solved this problem with the truckers, which I would vehemently disagree with. Now,
well, they tried. They had donations in Bitcoin, and all the truckers were like, "What the fuck do I do with this? I can't buy gas with this Bitcoin.
Gas stations don't take it.
So there was a
huge
huge problems. It wasn't useful in this case. Bitcoin was around, guys, when these trucker protests happened. And whatever your opinion on the trucker protests, whatever your opinion might be, Bitcoin was not useful as a medium of exchange.
Not at all. Just the same thing with the Ukraine, people sending crypto donations to Ukraine. There is absolutely no guarantee that money is ever going to end up in anything useful. Who knows what happened to all the money that was sent to the Ukraine? There's no accountability there. So, yeah, I mean, the government controls the internet. The government can make any site on the internet disappear. The government controls the banks and all of the facilities where you would normally be able to exchange crypto for actual money that you could use to pay your mortgage and your rent and your groceries. So this is the underlying falsehood behind this entire speech, is that Bitcoin would have fixed this. And that's absolutely false.
It's always this.
And
Did you want to say something?
Well, it's always this bait and switch.
Yeah.
It's always, listen, there are problems.
But Bitcoin fixes it.
There's corruption. There's problems with the government. There's corruption with our economics, with our financial system. Yes, and Bitcoin fixes it. Bitcoin is run by a private cartel. It's run by the miners.
Don't pay any attention
to that. It's run by the developers. It's run by the exchanges. All the money laundering that's going on behind the scenes. These are the people that run and own Bitcoin.
So Bitcoin fixes it. That's all you have to say. Don't ask any specifics.
So the idea that handing off the money supply to private special interests who are unaccountable is somehow better than the limited democratic governance we have over the money supply is ridiculous.
Yeah, and look, if Bitcoin would have solved this problem and been an improved situation, because let's just assume for the sake of argument that it was completely wrong for them to freeze these people's accounts. They couldn't have used the Bitcoin. The Bitcoin would have been much harder to use as actual money and pay for stuff anyway. What are these truckers going to do? How are they going to go into a gas station and fill up their tank with Bitcoin? They don't take Bitcoin. So it's just objectively speaking, it was not a solution to this problem, and it wouldn't have given them any more, quote, freedom, you know?
Yep.
A government that has the power to starve its citizens when they're disobedient will inevitably turn our entire country into serfs.
I mean,
this happened in Canada in a very narrow frame.
Don't people starve if they don't work? Like, isn't that how it works with the United States, where politicians are always trying to cut social services and food stamps? Like, you will literally starve.
Well,
so
this the Republicans are literally starving people. Yes,
this already happens, and he's pretending as though Bitcoin is going to solve that problem.
But this is all that kind of fear mongering, you know. Instead of saying I have a better plan to make things better, you just say, "Oh, things are going to get much, much, much worse if you don't listen to me."
They're communists. They're gonna starve you.
It is the ambition of every totalitarian regime to exercise complete control over every aspect of our lives. We live at a time now that technology has dangerously expanded the capacity for governments and corporations to control our lives. Distant, impersonal, multinationals and authoritarian technologies have usurped the realms of human activity that were once private or held by a community.
Yeah, and I mean, that's true.
True, yeah.
You know, I mean...
fair enough.
But it's corporations as much as it is government. Corporations are what are really hurting and clamping down on people and restricting their freedom more than government is, in my opinion. But this has been happening since the dawn of time. Since record keeping began, data has been tabulated and been able to be used against people. I don't think this is something new.
Well, I would certainly say some of the capabilities are new and perhaps more alarming.
Yeah.
But again, we get back to, does Bitcoin do anything to solve these problems? Not really.
And
no.
I mean, the blockchain is an even more detailed public ledger of your transactions. So if you're worried about government or any other entity wanting to know who you're doing business with, the last thing in the world you'd want to do is use Bitcoin.
Well, there's also the Oracle problem, right? Which is who controls what's going on to that blockchain.
Yeah.
And that's the question that you have to grapple with.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see that any of these technologies solve that problem.
No.
They monitor our every movement, our communications, our every transaction. And the technologies they use to monitor us can also be used to control us. Led by the United States,
but I'm not,
liberal democracies across the globe suddenly pivoted during the pandemic.
As if this fetal position,
Yeah, like as if this propaganda piece that we're watching right now isn't an attempt to control us.
Yeah, exactly.
To subvert democracy, to make sure people don't trust the government, so that there can be more private special interests that take up more of the common good.
He's throwing around this T word, totalitarian, and we don't live in a totalitarian regime. We have problems with our government, but we're nowhere near totalitarian. And, China can do some shit, but that's China. We still have most of our civil liberties here. There are some that have been chipped away at, for sure. And we need to fight to preserve and restore those. But I don't see the point in telling everybody, Hitler's going to be here next week,
Well, like anything, it has to be a nuanced discussion. There's lots of ways in which our societies are very totalitarian, but there are many things like freedom of information requests that would not exist in any kind of pure totalitarian regime. So, the United States isn't perfect.
Well, can you name something that is clearly totalitarian?
Oh, well, corporate structures are totalitarian. Absolutely.
Well, but that,
right?
but
you have
that's
one person
that's
in charge.
We're talking about absolute rule.
We're talking.
Corporations are not society,
but they can influence whether you live or die.
Right.
And whether in the way that the United States has structured things, if you have a health issue and you depend on the health insurance provided by your employer, and your employer fires you, I mean, that can be pretty serious. And those structures are controlled by essentially one person or a board of individuals, and their word is law.
Right, but I wouldn't call that totalitarian. It's kind of draconian. And
I would call it totalitarian. I
think we've had this discussion before in the past, right? Whereas, I assume totalitarianism is relation to a specific type of government.
Well, that's a very narrow definition. If you want to argue the semantics of that, that's fine. But
no, we don't want to go off on that tangent.
We could look at what is the essence of totalitarianism, and I think that you'd find that it is perfectly emulated in corporate structures, the way that they exist.
Yeah, except, when I think of totalitarian, I think of a dictator, a single person, whereas a corporation can be dictatorial, but it's not necessarily a dictatorship because it doesn't have one person. Now, you could say the board is the dictator.
Some companies don't have boards.
And you're right. It's like
some companies.
Tesla, Musk is the dictator because he has a majority share. Same thing with Zuckerberg and Meta. He is,
or Larry Ellison, or any of those billionaires.
And I would say,
right?
yes, that's dictatorship, and that company is a totalitarian corporation. Yes. So I can see where it'd be used. But anyway, Kennedy's use of totalitarian is more of a scare tactic. We're nowhere near having a totalitarian nation. There's no single person that has control. Now, we just came out of 4 years of somebody desperately trying to get there. But our system worked the way it was supposed to. It might have been a little bit of a bumpy ride, but we averted, Emperor Trump. So it's still working. I'd rather want to be hopeful.
We'll see what happens in 2024.
Oh, don't say it.
And use that crisis as an excuse to trample essential constitutional rights and freedoms. Government suspended the rights to free assembly, the freedom of worship, property rights, trial by jury.
Again, this is probably the main reason why I wanted to talk about this, what he's saying.
So how did he intro? Is he saying that the Canadian government did that?
No, now he's talking generally. Governments, now he's making allusions to the COVID thing. Suspending right to worship, right of assembly,
yes.
and freedom of speech in the name of misinformation. I actually cut this clip out and I'm using it in some other spots. So I want to let him finish and then I'll comment.
And they censored free speech in the name of combating misinformation and disinformation.
Which is, in my opinion, completely fucking reasonable. If you're going around spreading misinformation like ivermectin will cure COVID, when there's no fucking data for that, yes, that hurts people. That's like screaming fire in a crowded theater.
Yes.
This is what pisses me off about this bullshit that he's saying here. Is the suggestion that, and he says government. He doesn't say a particular regime or a particular thing, so he's straw manning all of government while this asshole wants to be in charge of that. Yep. That's a Republican tactic. That's not a fucking Democratic tactic. I don't know who the hell this guy is.
I don't know. I think it's just a political tactic, but I mean, yeah.
I don't hear Democrats going around going, government sucks, vote for me. But I hear a lot of Republicans doing that.
He's a well-known anti-vax nut. I mean, what can we say?
Yeah. I mean, this guy spread the ivermectin propaganda. He's been claiming vaccines cause autism. He's been anti-vax before even COVID. And there's tons you could search online, and there's just tons and tons of people who are actual experts in the field citing very real data. And of course, these people just dismiss all that as FUD and fake news.
There was one doctor in the UK who came out a number of years ago and was saying there was a link, and he was entirely discredited. The study that he published, or the information he was publishing, was manufactured. But of course, these people latched onto that.
Yeah. There could be 10,000 experts in the field, and maybe 3 of them have this fringe theory. So they will cling to those 3 and ignore the 9,997 who have even a stronger argument with more evidence. That's not, you got to hear our side of the story too. It's legitimate. That's bullshit. And him suggesting that government doesn't have any right to act. I mean, government exists to act in the overall best interests of the community. And if you're going around spreading lies, and of course, also, nobody prohibited the right of free assembly as far as church services and stuff like that. I think there was an exception in America where you could do this. There was, and of course, in some states they repealed that. But it's
I don't know.
No, I do know. I do know.
Okay, I don't.
Yeah. Because I would travel from one state to another, and I would notice in some states I'd see church services, and in some states they would be virtual. And different governors and different lawmakers in different areas had more or less restrictions. But the feds said, "Hey, we need people to stay inside. We need people to limit their exposure." It was a public health emergency. It was absolutely was. It wasn't totalitarianism. It wasn't them trying to take away people's rights. And of course, as soon as the COVID thing ended, everything went back to normal. They didn't double down on people's rights,
But that was because of the trucker protests.
So this is a big fundamental lie that this guy is, and he shouldn't be a Democrat saying this shit.
We lost our freedom to travel. The mandates cost us even sovereignty over our own bodies.
Another lie. Another complete
because people were being forced
lie.
To get vaccines. They were tying people down and forcing them to get vaccines.
That's nobody. If you didn't want to have the vaccine, nobody was going to make you have the vaccine. There was never any mandatory forcing of anybody. And even in China, I don't think they forced anybody.
Hold on. But I wouldn't go, I don't know what happened in all of China, so I wouldn't make that statement. But weren't there cases where people were going to lose their job unless they were vaccinated because they wouldn't be able to do their job? I mean, I think it's
there are cases like that where, like the trucker
coercion.
case, if you're not vaccinated, they're not going to let you cross the border. That's their prerogative. And if you want to come to my house, Sal, And I have a rule that says you got to take your shoes off when you enter. That's the rule. I'm not forcing you to take your fucking shoes off, but if you want to come in my house, you got to take your shoes off. But if you go on the newspaper and say, you know, Adam is forcing everybody to take their shoes off against their will, that's a fucking lie. Ugh, that makes me mad. And that's a common narrative among all the anti-vaxxers, that they were forced. There was a mandate. There was never nobody was compelled to take the vaccine. If you don't want to, fine, don't. And I'm totally cool with that. I'm all for it. If you're stupid enough to think that the vaccines are going to turn you into an alien or something, by all means, don't take it. Let's see if your natural immunity works. If it doesn't, then that's fucking evolution, and I'm on board with it. Just don't go around telling other people that lie and that bullshit.
I mean, if you live in the middle of nowhere and you never are going to visit someone or have someone visit you, then okay, there's probably a limited utility in getting that vaccine.
Right.
But for most people, you are going to be exposed to COVID, and it is better to be exposed through a vaccine. It is better to acquire that immunity through a vaccine than to be exposed to the actual disease.
Right.
That seems like a no-brainer to me.
Yeah, and a vaccine is basically just training your immune system, introducing your immune system to something that may come along so that it can be prepared. It's just like, you know, licking the floor or something like that. You're getting some bacteria, your immune system is going to be battling it. Now it recognizes it. Nothing wrong with that. Now, are there some side effects from sticking a needle in you? Absolutely. I mean, as opposed to not doing it, there's always a possibility, but the needle could be dirty. There could be some impurities in that particular dose. You just don't know. There's always, and everybody's body's different. Some people may react to certain things, but that's such a tiny little, and they've done studies on this. Is it possible that you could have a seizure after getting a shot? It's definitely possible. But as far as direct causation between that and any particular vaccines, that's very hard to prove. And the likelihood of, you dying from getting a vaccine is significantly lower than, say, you getting struck by lightning during a thunderstorm. But I don't see people running around in the rain going, I'm not letting this lightning interfere with my freedom, So I don't get this. It just seems like people have just become stupid.
Let's keep going.
Some might say, well, those were just temporary restrictions and temporary suspensions of our rights. But the Constitution has no pandemic exception.
Well, when was the Constitution written? 17 something?
I think everybody cheers.
And
yeah.
Look at all those happy people. They're all Republicans. That's Republicans and look at Republicans like, okay, he said something.
Yeah, if there's no provision in the Constitution specifically for COVID, why would you? The founding fathers didn't want you to be vaccinated against COVID.
Right.
Very
and you
clear.
know what else?
Very
there was no
obvious.
provision in the Constitution that said slavery was illegal or that women should vote or that black people could marry white people either. So it must be unnatural.
Someone's going to clip that. You're going to make your highlight reel.
And by the way, the framers of the Constitution knew all about pandemics. There was a malaria epidemic
They also knew about slavery.
decimated the armies of Virginia during the Revolutionary War, and a
Sorry, I didn't
smallpox
realize
epidemic that
vaccines
froze
were so
the armies
advanced
of New England
that time.
at the very time when Benedict Arnold had led the capture of the city of Montreal. And because smallpox had decimated that force, we were not able to hold Montreal. Otherwise, Canada today would be part of the United States. And the framers knew that.
You want to comment on that?
No, I'm just going to say that originally the entire Midwest, all the way down to Louisiana, a big part of the Mississippi used to belong to Canada. And I think that's what we should go back to. I think Canada should invade the United States and take over the land that is rightfully ours. It's, never mind First Nations people. It's rightfully Canadians. So, all you people in the Midwest and in Louisiana, I just want to let you know that as a Canadian, you're sitting on my land and I want it back.
All right. Well, you know what? I'm totally in favor of that.
Tell you what, we'll trade you Montreal. You can have Montreal. We'll take the rest.
I know was a good bit of Texas was in Louisiana Purchase too, right? I think.
There's a big yeah. I mean, we could bring up the map, but let's just keep going. I'll save my plans to invade the United States for another podcast.
Yeah. Suffice to say, I'm pretty sure, and this is something you could do research on, but I'm pretty sure that you couldn't just say just about anything, And this is where I would pull Robert F. Kennedy Jr. aside, and I would say, okay, so if I say you're a pedophile, that's my free speech, right? I have every right to do that. You can't take any action against me because you might think it's not true. If I'm hurting you, that's just my freedom of speech. I can yell fire in a crowded movie theater.
Yeah.
There's nothing in the Constitution that says you can't do that. Does that mean I can do that?
Yeah.
This is a slippery slope that he can't really,
Well, it's a dumb idea. The idea that, anything that's specifically, everything has to be specifically called out for it to be relevant. Of course.
Well, perjury is against the law. Lying under oath is against the law. That's not in the Constitution per se, but I don't think anybody disagrees with that. I don't think that's like your First Amendment right to lie your ass off. So, his line of reasoning is just faulty.
At the time, not only that, but between the end of the Revolutionary War and the ratification 9 years later of the Bill of Rights, there were epidemics in almost every city in our country. Smallpox epidemics, cholera epidemics, yellow fever epidemics that killed tens of thousands of people.
So does that mean that during those epidemics there were never any laws or rules or quarantines or restrictions?
Almost like you wish you had vaccines at that time. Almost like if you had vaccines, those tens of thousands of people would be alive.
Yeah, maybe. That's right. All those things he's citing, like smallpox and polio, they were all fixed by vaccines.
And yet, the framers did not put an epidemic exception in the Constitution. They wrote the Constitution not for easy times, but for hard times. And
you know what they did put in the Constitution? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, which a lot of these fuckers just ignore.
And during the Civil War, when we lost 659,000 troops killed in battle on both sides, it's the equivalent of 7.2 million today, a much worse loss.
People adjusted for inflation.
People adjusted
and it happened
for inflation.
in COVID, and our country was being torn apart and came this close to being ripped apart. And when Abraham Lincoln did the right thing and tried to suspend habeas corpus to prevent Confederate infiltrators from inciting riots in the northern cities, he was told by the Supreme Court, you can't do it. It's in the Constitution. It doesn't matter how bad the crisis is. You cannot suspend the Constitution.
I don't know much about that, so I would love to have a law historian comment on, because I have a feeling there was more circumstances there. So some kind of trying to stop rabble rousers, and maybe that was perfectly reasonable. But there's a difference between expressing your opinion.
It's a false equivalency, right?
Yeah,
It's a false equivalency. So instituting some measures for a real justified health pandemic versus suspending all of habeas corpus seems like those are two different things that have to be taken in historical context.
And also, you know what? I don't recall the government ever making it illegal for anybody to say batshit stupid stuff about the vaccines. So again, this whole thing is a huge straw man, because yes, Twitter may have suspended some accounts, Facebook may have suspended some accounts, YouTube may have pulled some videos that were spreading anti-science propaganda, but that was their prerogative as private systems to do that. That wasn't the government. I don't know of any government that sent the feds in to raid somebody's house because they tweeted about ivermectin. Do you?
I do not.
So I don't know exactly what suspension of civil rights even happened during COVID that he's inferring.
Well, hold on. I mean, there certainly were limitations. I think that's...
We were asked to not do this, to not do that.
No, I mean, I can't speak to how things were in the United States in specific jurisdictions. I can only speak to what was happening where I am. But
I do know in
don't
Italy,
even know how many
they
people
did have some laws
charged.
that said if you went out, you could get charged with,
like I think some people had some parties and they may have charged a couple of people here
with going against some very specific dictates, like against certain assembly.
Exactly. So, I mean, yeah, you weren't able to have a party with 30 people. Some people did it anyways. A lot of people probably did it. A lot of people weren't charged, but the government chose to make an example out of specific people, right? To send a message to say, hey, you shouldn't be mixing like that.
Which, and I don't really necessarily have a problem with that.
Yeah, I mean, as long as you're not like Boris Johnson and you were still having parties in the middle of the pandemic.
So, yeah, obviously, as a leader, you want to set a good example.
Totally correct.
But I don't find that to be one notch away from totalitarianism, like he's inferring. We were in a time of crisis. We had to take desperate measures, and most people realize this. It's just these whiny little right-wingers and some edge cases like him that felt like it was unjust.
There are a lot of things that could have been done better. There were a lot of failures. There were a lot of policies that perhaps didn't make sense, but I don't necessarily attribute that to an effort to establish a totalitarian state, right? It's the first serious pandemic in 100 years. You're not going to get everything perfect. So sure, there's some legitimate criticism, but taking it this far, I think, is ridiculous.
Pandemics are very special cases. I mean, if you look historically, we've done much more draconian measures in many cases, when there have been outbreaks where they would literally round people up in quarantine.
Well, you guys took all the Japanese people during World War II and put them into camps.
And that's a shameful point in our history that we've apologized for. And I believe we've even paid reparations.
Canadians did it too. So
I wasn't around. I didn't have anything to do with that. I would have protested it though. But I understand why it was done. I just think it wasn't, it was not a good thing. Yeah.
And yet we saw this very, very dangerous precedent that we now have, that we as American citizens are now facing in our country.
I don't think it's a dangerous
precedent.
I think it's
COVID,
a reasonable precedent.
Where the government established a new precedent, which is that if it has a good enough excuse, the government can now take away all of our freedoms.
See, that's a huge slippery slope fallacy right there.
There are many things. There are many. What were the words that he used specifically? There are many things that we've done that have established a dangerous precedent. Yeah. Citizens United is a dangerous precedent. Repealing Roe versus Wade is a dangerous precedent. Yep. There are a lot. There's the what is it? The law where
electing Trump was a dangerous precedent.
Absolutely. Well, there's also another one about that's supposed to apply to civil servants, so they can't be prosecuted for things that they didn't know, but it's been used to give law enforcement immunity from prosecution. So I can't remember the name of the law, but these are shitty precedents that should be overturned.
But again, when you talk about a precedent, ideally you're talking about a specific case, something that's actionable. You can point to that particular case and go, this is good and this is bad. But what Kennedy is doing is he's using precedent as a kind of a vague, ambiguous thing. He's
fear mongering. He's just fear mongering.
He could say, like I can say, the USA Patriot Act was a dangerous infringement on people's civil rights, and that is an actionable thing. We can point to a particular piece of legislation that what the liberties that thing chipped away at should be reversed. But when Kennedy says COVID set dangerous precedents, there's nothing actionable there. If he pointed to a very specific federal law that said, in the case of a pandemic, we can force people to get vaccines, then he'd have a point.
I'm willing to give him some leeway on that. Like,
I think you got to be specific. You got to talk specifics, or else it's just blather.
Yeah, I mean, I think we kind of all know what he's talking about. I just don't agree with it.
Yeah. Okay.
And guess what? there is always a good excuse, whether it's to stop a new disease, the next pandemic, to protect us from misinformation, to prevent domestic terrorism, to stop hate speech, to prosecute a war, or to fight climate change.
So again, humongous false equivalences there, just a whole pile of false equivalences. But I agree with some of those cases. You know, I do think that the government does use certain populist kinds of things to be able to push through certain kinds of agendas. And that is a concern. It should always be a concern of people. But again, it's better to talk specifics, because when you talk about a specific thing like the USA Patriot Act, see, instead of just all war, right? Then we can actually undo it. But when you just say all war, there's no real way to respond to that other than to just go, I hate government.
All right, let's keep going.
But all of these reasons can easily turn into pretexts. Control over the public starts perhaps as a means, but it always becomes an end. It's part of the unstated and seductive ideology of totalitarianism.
Again, he's strawmanning government as this entity whose main objective is to take over and control the people. That is not the objective of government. And this is a guy running for fucking government who doesn't even understand what government's role is. Government's role is to protect the interests of the people. It is not to be totalitarian. It's not to control people. It's to protect the interests.
Well, like, what is he proposing here? So he's just talked about domestic extremism and climate change. These are real problems that will require some type of federal intervention.
Absolutely.
So the question, of course, is what kind of intervention? How extensive? What are the checks and balances that are going to be put in place to make sure that, you know, any new law isn't abused? I mean, that's a very subtle, nuanced discussion. Instead, he's just painting it as government bad.
Yep, exactly. I mean, if this was 50 years older, he would be citing seatbelt laws and no smoking sections.
And he would say, you know, desegregating schools would also be another one.
He would be like, they're coming, they're going to allow black people in your schools. The next thing you know, it's going to be,
you're going to have interracial marriage. Oh yeah. They're going to be forcing you to have interracial marriages.
First it's helmets on motorcycles, and then it's the ovens.
I mean, yeah, this is the extent of the arguments that we're receiving here.
That utopia will come through exercising perfect control over society. And that works well as long as the good guys are in control, or your guys are in control. Bitcoin is a bulwark against precisely this kind of government and corporate expansion and intrusion.
No, it's not.
All right, let's just start laughing.
No, it's not. It's worse. It's the absolute worst case scenario. It's a completely privately controlled, not even currency. I mean, digital token.
Yeah, Bitcoin is not a bulwark.
There's no way to represent any kind of interest inside of Bitcoin except for the interest of increasing its value by as much as possible. Why do you think it can't be turned into a payment system? Why do you think any change that gets proposed that would make it more useful as a medium of exchange gets vetoed and people have to fork the project? Because there is literally no mechanism for democratic governance inside of Bitcoin. Right. It doesn't exist.
And you know what?
So
this interestingly ties in the premise that he was going with earlier of strawmanning government as this entity that wants total control. So if government is cracking down on crypto, his narrative is that's because they want to control everything and Bitcoin will not allow them to control it, so that's why they're against it. When in reality, government's real mandate is to protect the interests of the people. And the reason why government's cracking down on crypto is because crypto is predatory and exploitative, and it takes advantage of people.
Yep.
And this notion that Bitcoin is rises above the influence of government is utter bullshit, because Bitcoin could not exist without the internet, and the internet doesn't exist without government. Government created the internet, government subsidizes the internet, government pays for all of the telephone poles and the underground cables and the satellites and the cell towers. They control all that shit that 90+% of all the internet communications travels on, and they can say what goes in their network and what doesn't. And they're not going to stop something because it doesn't give them control. They're going to stop something because it doesn't represent the best interests of the people.
I mean, I understand the point you're trying to make, and you are correct in a very general sense. But specifically, there's more nuance there in terms of what is private and what is considered public infrastructure in terms of
true. But there's no doubt that the governments, and other special interests have significant control over what. And now without net neutrality,
absolutely,
there's a half dozen ISPs, and any one of those, AT&T, Comcast, Verizon, that run the backbone, any one of them at any time can say, we're not going to carry any Bitcoin traffic. And that's perfectly legal within their rights to do it, and nobody's civil rights grants them free internet. That's not in the Constitution either.
True. All right, let's
In
keep going.
fact, it has been used.
How much time is left on this talk, by the way?
It has been used to bypass oppressive government
stop yapping.
controls over the monetary systems, as in Canada and Myanmar. As president, I will make sure that your right to hold and use Bitcoin is inviolable.
There is no threat to stop anybody from doing that now. There's no legislation that's to outlaw
First,
Bitcoin.
I will defend the right of self-custody of Bitcoin and other digital assets.
Nobody's infringing on that right. There's no law taking that away from you.
You should be able to own your own private keys the same as you own the keys to your car or own your wallet. Your wallet, whether it's in your pocket or in your computer, is your own. I don't think the government has the right to demand access to your Bitcoin key or indeed any of your passwords.
I agree with that.
To say otherwise
but I think that's all
is
protected
to
under
cede
the
essential territory
under
to the
the
surveillance
Constitution.
state. Second, I will uphold the right to run a node at home.
Again,
Okay.
and nobody's making that illegal.
KYC requirements should be applied at the level of banks and exchanges, not at the level of nodes. Otherwise,
I don't have a problem with
Otherwise,
that
it would
either.
be- become impossible.
I can run a node right now.
Yeah, weren't you
Nobody is
weren't you
KYC.
running a node?
Hey, don't incriminate me. I plead the fifth. So yeah, I mean, I've done some experimentation with Bitcoin. But I think, again, straw man. Nobody is proposing to ban this. Although I guess if Bitcoin now has classified material and CP, then there may be some legal provisions about you
You
could
can
justify
prune,
it's
you can
illegal.
prune the blockchain supposedly in that respect, I hear. But yeah, I mean, I think what he's trying to do is he's
maybe.
trying to straw man Bitcoin in the same way he straw man
Just
vaccine
pandering.
mandates, right?
He's just pandering to the crowd.
He's suggesting that people were forced to get vaccines, just like people would be forced to, or they would criminalize Bitcoin, which they're not. They're not.
Possible to run the software.
Gonna
The whole
protect your rights
point of Bitcoin
participate
is
in the
that it's
Ponzi scheme.
decentralized. Anyone can run a node, and it's important not only for Bitcoin, but for democracy to be decentralized.
Misunderstanding of how Bitcoin works
And
the
democracy.
importance of nodes.
Third,
Miners can run
I
nodes,
will
guys.
defend
Just letting you know.
use-neutral, industry-neutral regulation of energy. President Biden's 30% tax on energy for Bitcoin miners requires an invasive surveillance apparatus to monitor what is happening in individual computers.
Now, this is something that I kind of partially agree with him on. Maybe we shouldn't be passing taxes on what people use electricity for, but I don't think he's implying that this would affect Joe Six-Pack, who's running a mining rig in his basement. When I bet in reality, if you looked at this legislation, it probably was mainly designed to affect very large mining consortiums that are actually causing problems on whatever grid they're on.
I mean, burn all the miners to the ground. That's what I think. It's completely economically useless. So why do we even tolerate it?
Yeah, I mean,
It's complete garbage.
the whole Bitcoin energy argument, I think he talks more about it. We can comment.
It sets a terrible precedent. in which everything that you do that requires electricity must now be monitored by the government.
See, this is another slippery
That's
slope
why I
fallacy.
also support people's rights to refuse smart meters in their homes.
Now, the reason why you're against smart meters is because you, Mr. Dumbass, think that Wi-Fi gives people cancer. He's also against 5G and all this other stuff. He's one of these conspiracy theorists that thinks all that stuff does stuff to people's heads and stuff.
Fourth,
Has money but no brains.
I will make sure that the United States remains the global hub of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies.
What a fucking awful idea.
Major established
pandering
companies
right
like
here.
PayPal, Fidelity, and Block are investing heavily in Bitcoin-related software development. Some of the
be
best
asking why.
engineers and coders in the tech industry work in this field, and we want to keep them here in America. I will reverse the government's growing hostility toward this industry and keep innovation at home.
Again, another straw man. The government, it's not so much hostility towards the industry, it's enforcement of existing anti-fraud law. They have to just spin everything as some kind of an attack.
I mean, I don't know. I say I take a slightly different position. I say it's good if the government is hostile towards this stuff. They should take exactly the stance that China took. It's completely useless. You don't want those engineers working on a technology that's primarily used to exploit people or to launder money or to facilitate drug cartels. You want them working on useful, productive things. And
Yeah,
so
but I don't.
incentives need to align.
I would
to
argue
encourage
that
behavior.
government's main job is to enforce the law, not to necessarily engage in behavioral or vocational modification.
I completely disagree. The
right.
government.
Well, we'll agree to disagree on that. You're the one that lives
government
under a
has all
monarchy,
sorts
so
of-
I don't know.
Yeah, it's even worse. It's like technically God is the head of our state, right? Because that's who the Queen gets all her power from.
right.
So, but anyways, no, I mean the government influences behavior all the time. They
Absolutely,
say you can
but,
do this, but you can't do that. This is legally sanctioned. This isn't. This is fraud.
I
So-
understand. I just think there's limits to it. Like you said, there's nuances here.
Yeah, absolutely.
That leads to my fifth point. Events like the FTX calamity prove that some kind of regulation of the crypto industry is needed. My administration will consult with
regulate
knowledgeable
fraud.
people like yourselves to establish sensible jurisdiction and governance. For starters, we must recognize that Bitcoin is not a security.
Trust the foxes to build the hen houses, guys.
This Bitcoin is not a security thing. We'll have to have a whole show just on that because Bitcoin can be multiple things. It could be a security or a commodity. It just depends on how you use it.
And should not be regulated as such. Bitcoin is in a class by itself. Its wide decentralization, I'm told now that there are 40,000 nodes, prevents a
doesn't
lot of
mean a
the
fucking
insider
thing.
trading, manipulation, and pump and dump schemes that plague other cryptocurrencies.
Bullshit.
Six,
Bullshit. That's such a misunderstanding of
I
how this
will
stuff works.
Yeah, that's just completely false. Yeah.
The issue is
He said,
this
"I'm
on
told,"
this-
though, so he's got plausible deniability.
Yeah.
carefully consider whether individuals like Ross Ulbricht were prosecuted.
Oh yeah, you're gonna give a guy that was trying to hire people to kill others
Yeah.
a free pass? Okay.
I will consider whether they were prosecuted for actual crimes.
Should pardon
Or-
Lee Harvey Oswald too then.
So this fucker's a lawyer, and were they prosecuted for crimes or?
As a means to crack down on crypto.
Yes, the government just wanted to crack down on crypto, so they just fabricated this illusion that the dude was running a dark net market, selling drugs and weapons and illegal information and people's personal information,
Yeah.
and hiring hitmen to kill people that he didn't like.
He was trying to hire hitmen to kill one of his administrators, guys. This
Seven.
is the person that
he
this
hired.
person is
He
talking
hired
about.
hitmen to try to kill 7 people.
7 different people.
Yeah,
Wow.
and yeah, I looked it up. And he also was indicted on one of those counts too, but they never took him to court because he already got sent to prison for life for running the Silk Road thing.
Technically, though, he shouldn't have been charged with anything because he's a libertarian and none of those laws apply to him.
Right. He was traveling, and
he said so. No, it doesn't apply to him. He said, I don't believe in these laws. He's a sovereign citizen.
If they'd been unjustly made an example, I will consider pardoning them, and I will act very quickly to do so.
That is like such pandering.
You're a piece of shit.
I mean, the guy he's talking about tried to hire hitmen like 7 times, and it's not just hearsay. There's plenty of evidence.
Before I conclude, I'd like to say something about the environmental criticism at Bitcoin. It may be unpopular to say here, but even though those criticisms are exaggerated, they have some degree of validity. It's exaggerated because Bitcoin miners chase the cheapest energy.
That is true. Bitcoin miners chase the cheapest energy, but what is the cheapest energy? That's going to be the polluting fossil fuel stuff.
It doesn't even matter. Like the whole point is that's carbon we don't need to use. That's electricity that could be used for other purposes.
Right. And Bitcoin mining doesn't produce anything useful. It's wasting energy for the sake of operating the network.
It's literally just guessing numbers.
It's not even using that energy in the normal operation of the network. It's just a guessing game to see who gets the little bonus subsidy every 10 minutes. Yeah,
They have to do that for economic reasons. And Bitcoin mining tends to go where the energy is the least expensive,
which is going to be
drawing
fossil
a lot
fuels.
of idle base load as well as excess peak generation of renewable power. But I think Bitcoin miners can still do a lot better, and I encourage you in this industry to expand your use of pro-environmental energy techniques, such as capturing waste methane and using waste heat, which I know many of you are experimenting with. We environmentalists will continue to pressure you to improve. However, whether or not the criticism is valid, I want to make one thing plain. The environmental argument should not be used as a smokescreen for an agenda of suppressing Bitcoin.
Again, who has an agenda of suppressing Bitcoin? There's this, you know what I mean? There's this cabal he's alluding to.
Hold on. I do want to suppress and destroy Bitcoin, but I want to do it because it's a bad technology. It's exploitative. There are very good reasons why I want to do that. I'm not doing that because I don't support that position.
Government does not really have that.
Right. We know what he's getting at.
I agree with you, but I would not characterize my motivations as wanting to destroy Bitcoin. I just want to spread the truth, and I think it'll just die a natural death when people realize what it really is. I have no desire to plant plastic explosives around some facility and try to destroy it or pass laws making it illegal. I think we can get rid of Bitcoin, and I don't even want it to get rid of it. It can still exist, and some dingbats can trade it on their little computers here and there. I just don't want the Bitcoin to be promoted as some kind of new technology or some kind of an investment when it's neither. That's what I don't like.
I want to drown it in a bathtub.
Okay, so there's a difference between me.
You should not be used as a pretext for an agenda of suppressing
If you're Bitcoin, do not get around salad in a bathtub.
Hate anything that they can't control. And they will use any pretext necessary to control it. I am aware of an eerie parable to the COVID years when public health became a pretext to obliterate our basic rights and freedoms.
Yeah, public health, quotey quotes.
Okay, what do you imagine this multi-millionaire was doing? He was probably traveling around on his private jet to different vacation homes all around the world, and he's talking about how his freedoms were infringed upon.
Right, he couldn't land in Bali anymore or the British Virgin Islands on Wednesday because of this.
Yeah, I mean, it's always funny. These populists are always the most
oligarchs.
privileged people.
He's an
the
oligarch is what he is. Yeah, it's always these guys that are arguing for a monetary system that has even more wealth concentration than the present system they're in.
Yep.
The COVID public health emergency is gone now, And we must not now replace it with some new set of rationales to further the decades-long erosion of our freedoms.
I wonder if everywhere he's going around giving talks, he does that same kind of weird thing where he'll tie COVID into, he'll be speaking at like some kind of meat packers plant, and he'll be talking about they want to take away your right to farm beef, just like they did during COVID.
Yeah. I mean, what's really insidious about it is that it's really, what's really eroded people's freedoms over the last 50 years is this neoliberal ideology, this idea that there's no room for any common enterprise. There's no room for the public sector. Everything has to be a market. Everyone has to be a competitor. There have to be winners and losers. It's this neoliberal ideology. That's really what's infringed on people's labor rights, on their rights to have health care, on rights to have a living wage. And it's just so gross when someone uses these actual legitimate problems to advocate something that would make those same problems much, much worse.
Yeah, and this is something that we, the people, really need to. We can't afford to tune out. We can't afford to look at this guy and go, "Oh, he's nutty." Ignore him, because he's got a lot of people that he's hoodwinked into believing that there's a they out there and that government is big and bad and evil. And this movement is growing. You can see now it's leaked into the Democratic Party from the Republicans. And we can't afford to ignore it. We have to fight against this. When these people say this batshit crazy stuff, you have to get involved. You can't just go, all politicians are bad. They're not all bad. You have people like AOC and Elizabeth Warren who are really looking out for people, for all people, including these dingbats. But they're not all bad.
Finally, I'd like to clarify a couple of things. I'm not an investor, and I'm not here to give investment advice or to promote Bitcoin over other cryptocurrencies or other currencies. That's the job of the free market, not the President of the United States.
Free market.
My interest is one, I am an ardent defender and a lifelong defender of civil liberties. And Bitcoin is both an exercise and a guarantee of those freedoms.
Yeah, not at all.
Two, Bitcoin is a major generator of the kind of innovation our country now needs.
No, there's no innovation.
Three, Bitcoin...
And again, you could say those vague ambiguities, but where's the specifics? There's,
embodies two of my highest ideals, transparency and trust. Yeah. Americans have come to distrust the government, including the way that...
You're right. Americans have come to distrust the government because of assholes like you who say they're going to get you. They want to control everything.
I mean, there's legitimate reasons to not trust the government. There are legitimate reasons.
No, there are legitimate reasons to not trust specific people in government. There is no legitimate reason to...
No.
I mean, unless your government is totalitarian... Yes.
Disagree, because there's been good research that has been done about this, about when laws get passed, whose interests do they represent? And by and large, over the last 50 years, we're now at the point where a law that is supported by, 80% of people has no better than a 50-50 chance of actually making it into law. Whereas laws that are promoted by
that's not the fault of the government, though. You know what that is the fault of? That's the fault of corporate media.
That's
and
the
other special interest groups that keep
You're absolutely
people ignorant.
Correct. You're absolutely correct, but it's also the fault of the systems that we have that allow that to occur.
Yeah, but there are facilities within those systems to compensate and fix that. And and all of the I'm going to talk about my country,
disagree.
The USA.
Hold on. I just want to say I don't disagree, but I think there are legitimate criticisms. The issue is that they try to pull a bait and switch. They try to say, okay, there are legitimate criticisms, and the answer is Bitcoin. And it's that second part that I object to.
Right. Well, there are legitimate criticisms, but when you say government, that's a vague, ambiguous abstraction. That's not actionable. If you really want to fix things, if somebody says, I got so much to do today, and you say, well, what do you got to do? Lots. That doesn't give anybody any indication of what's going to get done today. But if you say, I got to mow the lawn, I got to check my mail, I got to do the laundry, bam, bam, bam. Those then things can get done. But when you just say government is bad, there's nothing actionable. This is one of the things that really bugs me. And if you do, as long as, and all these people speak in these vague generalities, and that's how and nothing ever gets done. Nothing ever improves.
I agree with you. It would be better if people were specific, because then there would also be no room. Because the reason that they use this ambiguous language is because
they don't have a solution. They don't have a platform.
Well, no, it's the 10 different people. Government means 10 different things. And so for some people, when they hear, bad government, they think, oh yeah, he's talking about the system of lobbying that allows corporate special interests to have undue influence on our politicians. And someone else hears it and goes, oh, he's talking about the Supreme Court.
My taxes are too high. Right. Everybody makes it into something else and nothing gets done.
Right. Exactly. So I think you are correct. It is more helpful if there's some specificity.
Yeah. It's just logic 101. If you're going to complain about something, complain about it specifically enough so that there's an obvious, actionable way to address it. If not, then all you're doing is just making things worse.
It has manipulated our money supply to benefit the very rich and to prosecute endless wars. Bitcoin is a neutral currency, beyond the ability of government or indeed any authority to manipulate.
That's bullshit.
In our current system, nearly all of our transactions are transparent, all right. They're transparent to government and corporations. No, they're not.
Bullshit.
But their machinations and activities are not.
It's called Switzerland.
Yeah, but I mean, my transactions are not transparent to government. If they want to look up my transactions, they might have to get a search warrant or something like that, or it's possible they could do that, but they could still do the same thing with Bitcoin.
Transparent to us, they are opaque. The public ledger of Bitcoin makes every transaction transparent to everyone. It might therefore be a harbinger of a future in which the government is transparent to the people, and that would be democracy.
I don't know where he draws that.
Technical solutions are not going to solve social problems, cultural problems, governance issues.
How does Bitcoin make government transparent?
It's ridiculous. It's garbage.
I'm proud to make an historic announcement. But first, if you can please pull out your cell phones, our campaign will be the first presidential campaign in history to accept Bitcoin donations through...
I don't think he's the first.
Through the Lightning Network.
Through the Lightning Network.
And today we move
which is great because you can't send him any Bitcoin through Lightning unless you set up a node yourself, and that requires at least an hour, assuming you have all the software set up. So he's telling people, get out your phone. There's nobody that's sending him Bitcoin via Lightning during this thing, because unless they already had it up. Well, maybe some people in this room do have Lightning.
Yeah. I gotta go soon, so let's wrap it up.
Closer to the future. Today we show the world the power and the durability and the flexibility of Bitcoin. I want to conclude by saying this. Almost everyone in this room is aware of the link between Bitcoin and democracy and freedom. And that's why almost everybody that I meet who is involved in Bitcoin is passionate about it. They're not passionate because it's an interesting currency. They're passionate because of the deep representation of a deep need that we have for liberty and democracy, and the promise that this innovation has to guarantee those virtues.
Yeah, it's all freedom fighters in that
as you're talking about destroying the government, destroying
we
democracy.
We are now living in this age of turnkey totalitarianism, where this emerging technology which can empower totalitarian regimes. And our job is to try to build and fortify democratic institutions at the same rate as that totalitarian instruments are being expanded in their power.
See all these vague
things like AI, which really are going to threaten democracy at its base. We need to not be chipping away at our democratic institutions. We need to be fortifying the ones that exist and building new ones. And the biggest, most important one on the horizon is Bitcoin. because it can't be manipulated.
It's not a democratic
All of
institution.
you, I know, are here
It literally
again,
can't
not
be a
because you love
democratic
a currency,
institution.
but because you love our country, you love democracy, you
There's
love
nothing
freedom.
democratic about Bitcoin.
And in that sense, your support of Bitcoin puts you in the same category as the framers of the Constitution that gave us that Bill of Rights, that created these democratic institutions. And you are the
And if
current
you sit right there,
manifestation
somebody's going
of
to
that
come along and
impulse.
hand you a
So
powdered
thank you all
wig
very much
on the
for
aisle.
everything that you
Put on your
do.
powdered wigs.
And thank you for being part of
Does
this
that
movement.
mean they want to exterminate First Nations peoples because they're just like the founders? of the
Everybody,
Constitution?
your attention, Bitcoin maxis. You are the founding fathers of the
Jesus.
Constitution.
Final thoughts?
Ooh, just that was some batshit crazy level 10 right there, you know. And all this totalitarianism that he's alluding to, I don't see it anywhere. I didn't see jackbooted thugs coming down the street, dragging people out of their houses, making them get vaccines. This is nuts. And I'm as somebody who is probably going to vote Democrat this year, I'm really dismayed that he's even going to be on the ballot to be nominated. A shame.
Good luck. Good luck, my friend.
Thank you. All right, we'll wrap this up because Sal's got actual productive things to do.
we could come if you want. We could record like a little conclusion later.
Well, I think this is it. I think we'll just wrap it up. We thank everybody for watching. We be sure to tune into the Discord because that's where all the activity is happening. And visit ioradio.com. And until next time, guys, we'll see y'all soon.
And as always, to our 4.5 listeners, thank you for joining us.
Good night.